move to our final panel of the day, and in this focus on accountability, we thought it was incredibly important to have the chair of the UN fact-finding mission on Iran, Sara Hossain, join us here. She traveled a very long way, I understand, to be here with us. Los Angeles is not always the easiest place to get to, depending on where you live in the world, and so we're very grateful for her presence and for her to speak with us here. The conversation, she will be in conversation with Nazanin Boniadi, actor and activist. Nazanin is known to many of you, but I'll run through their bios as well for anybody who has yet to know these two wonderful women. Nazanin, in addition to being an acclaimed actress, she's a decades-long human and women's rights advocate with a focus on Iran. She is an Amnesty International UK ambassador, a member of the steering committee for the World Movement for Democracy, and a board director for the Burman Center for Human Rights in Iran. In 2022, she became a leading figure on the global stage, advocating for the people of Iran and the Woman Life Freedom Pro-Democracy movement. And she is the 2023 Sydney Peace Prize laureate. Sara Hossain is the chair of the UN Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran. She's a barrister in the Supreme Court of Bangladesh, practicing in constitutional public interest and family law. She's a partner in the law firm of Dr. Kamal Hossain and Associates and serves pro bono as the honorary executive director of the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust. She has served on several UN bodies, including the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on the 2018 protests in the occupied Palestinian territory and the United Nations Trust Fund for Victims of Torture. She was educated at the University of Oxford in the UK. Sara and Nazanin, if you come join us here. Thank you. And just one quick note as well is that we will be taking questions. So again, we'll be distributing notepads, and anybody can submit a question for the end.
Thank you, Gisu, for the kind introduction. It's an honor, such an honor to be with you here today, Sara. I was there in Geneva when you said those powerful words and held the Islamic Republic accountable for their crimes against humanity. So thank you for all you do. For those in the audience who don't know what the fact-finding mission is and what it's tasked to do, can you tell us a bit about it? Where is it? Where is it based? How's it set up? What's it responsible for doing?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to everyone here who has helped the fact-finding mission enormously over the last year and a half since we've been in operation. We were set up by the Human Rights Council through a resolution of the member states who are part of the Human Rights Council in November 22. And there are three of us who sit on the fact-finding mission. Myself, Professor Shaheen Sardar Ali, who's a Pakistani-British academic, and Viviana Krisicevic, who's an Argentinian human rights lawyer. And we have this amazing team. My colleague here, Ida, who many of you may know, heads a secretariat of experienced investigators and open source investigators, forensics, and others who are working. We're all working together. And the point I think about this fact-finding mission is it's, as Gisu said, it's independent, it's international, it's supported by the UN High Commissioner's Office, the High Commissioner of Human Rights' office in some ways, but it's completely separate from it. And I guess it's also important that in these many decades since there's been concerns over human rights violations in Iran, there hasn't been a kind of standing investigative body that's been established by the Human Rights Council. That's the first time it's happened. We had initially a mandate to work until March 2024. So we had a sort of year and a bit to work, and then in March our mandate was renewed for another year. So we'll continue until March of 25. And essentially what we're looking at is we're investigating human rights violations that have occurred in Iran since the 16th of September, so since the day that Jina Mahsa Amini died in custody. And we've got two basic tasks, I suppose. The first is to investigate, and the second is what we've been all talking about all day today, is about collecting and preserving evidence for use in legal proceedings. So at this stage of our work, we're really doing the second half more. I mean, we're still investigating, but we're trying to collect and preserve all of the evidence that we found so that it can be used, perhaps by some of you here and by others, to bring people to account for the violations that have occurred there.
Thank you. And I know that the FFMI issued a report this past March, as well as a more in-depth conference room paper. What stood out to me was that the FFMI concluded that the IR committed crimes against humanity during the Women Life Freedom protests, and also that justice in domestic courts is not possible, and urged other countries with the ability to do so to investigate Iranian officials for crimes against humanity. Can you tell us a bit more about these findings?
Sure. Well, first we found, there were gross violations of human rights. So, again, as many of you will be aware, that included a large number of killings and injuries as a result of the disproportionate and unlawful use of force. It included arbitrary arrests and detention on a huge scale. I mean, we know that in 2023, the government of Iran acknowledged that they had pardoned and released some 22,000 people, and that indicated obviously that there were far larger numbers perhaps who were affected by the arrests and detentions. We also found cases of torture and ill treatment in custody, including of children, and also sexual violence of some of those who were taken into custody. And significantly, you'll have seen, I think, many of the reports that have come out in the last year. We also found fair trial violations, and some of which led to the death penalty. In addition, again, we've talked about this a bit today earlier, we also found very widespread surveillance and intimidation and harassment. You've heard a lot today about how not just the protesters themselves, but families of protesters, families of those who sought justice for the killing of protesters, they also came under this kind of intimidation and harassment. So we also have documented all of that. And in addition, I mean, because we had our mandate particularly focused on the impact of human rights violations on women and children, we looked in particular at issues of structural discrimination against women, and we found that that kind of structural discrimination was part of the root causes of what was driving the violations that happen across Iran to all people, and it's a kind of enabler of these gross human rights violations. And as you said, Nazanin, we also did make in the end findings around crimes against humanity having occurred, because of the widespread and systematic nature of the gross human rights violations that we found. So in relation to murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, and also in terms of gender persecution.
And in March, of course, you had the mandate extended for a year. Can you tell us what your priorities are going to be for this upcoming year?
We're going to carry on investigating some areas and deepening some of the work that we've already done, and also looking into particular issues that we weren't able to look into in as much depth earlier. So, for example, certain groups, artists, for example, and the kind of persecution they've faced, as well as sports people. And also just some of the work that's coming out from, again, the people we've heard from earlier today, the reports on blindings, reports on enforced disappearances, attacks on children, harassment of children, all of that. So I think we'll be pulling together a lot of that this year as well. And in addition, we're really focusing on going a bit beyond just investigating and documenting violations to try to identify a person's responsible. That's quite difficult in many ways, and you know some of the challenges we have. In the most recent, I think one of the most recent statements by the Iranian government described us all as puppets. So we're not puppets of various, I guess, other international forces. But we don't have access to the country, and we've tried to elicit responses from the government of Iran. We've sent, I think, 29 letters so far, and letters are not just a sort of hi, hello, but very detailed sets of questions around all kinds of issues. I think we've only had responses to one of those letters so far. So in the face of all of that, trying to make very clear the whole process of trying to identify persons responsible and look at what are the structures in terms of command responsibilities and so on, it's quite difficult, but we're trying to spend as much time as possible in this year on doing that, particularly because we're not sure whether we will be able to continue after March 25 or not. So we're anxious to get as much of this information and evidence and analysis together so that the work can be taken forward by others in case the mandate here doesn't continue.
And speaking of the Islamic Republic's letter, it's interesting for those of us, several of us here were in Geneva, and we saw the presence of gongos, or a lot of gongos trying to sort of lobby on their behalf. What has been your interaction with the Islamic Republic, if any, and what has been their reaction to your fact-finding mission?
Well, as I said, it's not been terribly welcoming. I think when we first started, I think the initial reaction was just a rejection of the entire mandate. And then we asked, as I said, to visit, and we got a kind of no response to that. Then we asked to meet with the permanent mission. We got no response to that, in the one in Geneva. The one thing we have had is we had some, as I said, we've had one response, one letter in response to 29. Not bad, something. And we also have had another point of engagement, which is the previous president of Iran had set up something called the Special Committee on the 2022 unrests. And so we did actually speak with that committee a couple of times. We in the end, unfortunately, had to conclude that that committee was not, didn't really sort of meet the basic tests of what an independent and effective investigative body would be under international law, as in it wasn't particularly independent. There were people who were nominated onto it who had previously made statements about, calling for repressive action against protesters and so on. So there were issues about their independence. But we also found that the committee had told us when we first met with them that they would be undertaking a series of engagements with the public and taking various actions. But when in the course of our investigations over the whole year, we couldn't find anybody who had actually met with the commission, or met with this committee, or had been reached out to it, or had even seen any public statements about what they were doing. So, as I said, we haven't really had the kind of engagement we would want with any government that you are investigating. But I suppose we can feel that we're having some impact from the fact that we keep on being denounced ritually. So I think that maybe something effective is happening from that front.
Speaking of denounced, what do you feel has been some of the greatest challenges during this work, and maybe just to give us hope, some of the highlights?
Well, I think the challenges have been not having access to the country. Definitely, that's been really, because you can see, it's how important it is to hear someone directly, and to see someone, to hear someone, to be with them. That hasn't been possible. And I think the other big challenge was not only the lack of physical access, but because of the level of surveillance. What in many other countries you might be able to do, we were able to do it eventually. Let me tell you about that. But initially we were very concerned that given the intensity of the surveillance, even trying to do remote interviews and so on, may put people under further very serious risk. So we were quite cautious initially about conducting interviews in country, even though we were doing it remotely. And we had a lot of internal debates about this. Should we take the risk? Should we, in our search for the truth, make other people, put people into jeopardy, and particularly in a situation where we can't go out there to get them or do anything further to protect them. But in the end, I think the position we reached was that, as people have said in the previous panels, that when people have extraordinary courage and they know that they're fighting for something that they want, and they want the change, and they want to tell their stories, and they want to be heard, because know that the only way you can have change is to be heard and to have other people listen. I think when that was clear to us, that people wanted to take on the risk, that it was their decision. We talked a lot about agency, right? And so if people make their own choices, then all we had to do was enable that, right? We were not forcing them to do something that they didn't want. So I think once we clarified those issues for ourselves, we were able to overcome that. We were able to interview many, many people in the end. And I think that was a part of why I think what's been valuable, and what we've also, I think, found important about the work we were able to do, is that in the end those contacts were made, and we were able to, I think, provide some channel for people's voices to come out.
Yes, you absolutely did, and we thank you for that. I know you've been working diligently and devotedly on behalf of women's rights across the world, in your native Bangladesh and across the world, for decades. Do you find any parallels between that and what you're doing now, and how has that informed your work for the fact-finding mission?
Well, it's when we started this work, Obviously, all I knew about Iran was what any, I suppose, reasonably informed person might know, but not much beyond. And then we had a crash course and, learning about Iran's history and politics, and of course, about human rights. But many times over the last year and a half, I did wonder that should I actually be spending this time on Iran, because there are so many things happening in Bangladesh and it's so difficult. And each time I'd come away but not that we had to travel much, courtesy the Iranian government not letting us in, but we did have to go to meet our team and work together. So each time I'd go, like colleagues would say, like, for heaven's sake, like, we have so much to do, why are you going away? And then a couple of months ago, when, I don't know, some of you will be aware that we had a rather extraordinary student movement in Bangladesh, which led to the fall of our autocratic leader just over 2 months ago. When that happened, I realized what the point of all this was. I mean, there is a point, of course, I don't mean it like that. Of course, it's immensely important to do the work on Iran, for Iran, but I suddenly felt like everything we'd done on Iran was entirely relevant to Bangladesh. The whole analysis of mass killings, arbitrary arrests, thousands of people injured, and horrifically, even the blindings. We've had now scores of young people who've been blinded in Bangladesh by being shot at, just like Ilahi described, happened to her. Torture, harassment and intimidation of families, use of people's mobile phones, seizing the information on phones to blackmail people, harass and intimidate them from protesting, all of that. And it was so peculiar that as this unfolded, from the beginning of July onwards, I just thought, my God, I'm living inside our report. What's going on? I know this stuff. And when we were sitting out and we were in meetings and press conferences in court trying to deal with these issues, we'd be like, oh my God, that's chapter 7, that's chapter 8, that's the accountability chapter. So I think there was something extraordinary about that. And the other part was, how voices like Ilahi's, Khusru's, everyone, so many of you in this room, we saw, again, the internet, social media was critical to our movement, as it was in Iran back in 2022. And these images started circulating. Some of you have seen that little notebook I had out here. Maybe some of you have copies of it. Yeah. So that picture on the front of Jina Mahsa is from our leading university, Dhaka University, in our capital. And it was painted on the walls, on the side of our walls, most of our walls in Dhaka city until 2 months ago only had like government slogans on them. So as part of like restricting space, when even public space and walls where people are used to writing graffiti is taken over, and we just had these beautifully calligraphy slogans written on them in Bangla saying the march of development will continue, these kind of grandiose statements by the government. And then there's this one wall by the Teacher Student Center which used to still have proper graffiti, and that had this image of Jina Mahsa back in sometime in October, November 22. And a journalist friend sent me the image, and it had her name on the right, and on the left it said in Bangla, Shoirachar Nipatjak, which means end to the dictatorship, or death to the dictatorship. And we printed off this notebook back in March of this year when we were at the Human Rights Council. But we still had a kind of, not a dictatorship, but a kind of an autocracy in Bangladesh. So I thought, by way of abundant caution, I wouldn't print the picture with death to the dictatorship on it. So we had a previous edition of this notebook, but now I printed it with the full picture. And that was thanks to Jina Mahsa and the movement around her and how it was memorialized. But also this year we had, during our movement, many images of Iranian protesters, and we had these kind of double images where there would be a picture of someone from 22 somewhere in Iran, carrying a body or standing up to face the firing on them, and then you'd have a picture underneath of a Bangladeshi protester. So I think that kind of that whole process has has made very clear why it is that we kind of have to stand up for each other, and there's nothing really more important first than speaking out, and second than solidarity. I think that, as I said, I kept thinking I'm being distracted. I should be focusing on Bangladesh. But in the end, Iran wasn't a distraction. Iran was an absolutely critical part of fueling what happened in Bangladesh as well. And I think that, I think it's important for all of us to kind of see how it may be a very long path, but it's kind of a path you have to stay on. And once you know in a way that you can hear other people's voices, then you have no choice really but to try to stand with them and try to repeat the stories that you hear so that the voices get louder and louder until you finally have the change. And by way of hope, I would just say that the change in Bangladesh it's been happening for years because there's been so much repression for so many years. But when it happened very quickly. Like no one could even imagine it was going to happen, honestly. On the 5th of August, at about 12 o'clock, I was standing in front of our gate, and we could still hear shots. And I was waiting to get some news because we'd been told, one of our colleagues from our chambers, from our firm, had been arrested that morning. He's normally a tax lawyer and a corporate lawyer, but he couldn't take it anymore, and he was out going on a march, and he got picked up. And then we heard that 5 young women had been picked up, and they were being held in a police station, and they were being beaten in that police station. And again, other colleagues were going to try and rescue them. That was at about 12 o'clock. By 2 o'clock, on that same street, there were no barricades. At 12 o'clock, there were also barricades on either side of our street, and all you could see was police on either side and students and people on the other end trying to get through, but they couldn't. By 2 o'clock, the barricades had gone, the police had gone, and people were just singing and laughing and jumping for joy. So things can happen. I know it seems like it's going to be a very long road, and maybe it will and maybe it won't, but the point is you have to stay on that road until you get to the end.
I couldn't agree more, and how rewarding that must feel for everything that you've done over the years, that you've achieved this moment for your country. And I think it should give us all of us hope that that is entirely possible, right, for Iran. I'd like to... It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Okay, Kamran would like to ask, before I open it up to questions... Oh, sorry, Ella wanted to ask a question.
ممنونم از توضیحاتی که دادن. حالا من آقای خسرو ترجمه کردن تعدادشو. من فقط یه سوالی دارم. خانم سارا حسین گفتن که در ایران الان دسترسی ندارن به خیلی از کسایی که آسیب دیدن یا قربانی هستن یا زندانی هستن. من یه سوالی دارم که شاید خیلی از مردم این سوالشون هست: چرا زمان اعتراضات داخل ایران کسی رو به صورت مخفی نفرستادن که از نزدیک ببینن چطور تیراندازی میکنن، چطور ماموراشون دارن ترس و رعب و وحشت ایجاد میکنن؟ خودشون مطمئنا اگه میرفتن خب دردسر داشت، ولی افراد مخفیانه میتونستن بفرستن. آیا این امکان داره برای تظاهرات بعدی، قیام بعدی، دوباره کسانی بفرستن که خودشون از نزدیک شاهد بشن؟ ما منتظری نباشیم که جمهوری اسلامی نمایندای خودشون که تو حکومت خودشون هستن و به عنوان کمیته تحقیقات معرفی کنن.
So Elohe is asking, you mentioned during your remarks that we don't have access to many victims and people who are imprisoned or affected by state persecution. Why during the protest movements doesn't UN send someone, even covertly, to countries like Iran to actually witness directly what is happening in the context?
چون چیزی که مردم همیشه در ایران من شاهد بودم که میگفتن که حتی خود من هم میگفتم در ایران که چرا حامی ما نیستن، چرا یکی از اونها نمیان از داخل ماها رو ببینن و مشاهده کنن. پس حقوق بشری وجود نداره، حقوق بشر کنار مردم ایران نیست.
It's a question that Elohe and many others like her have always had is why international organizations and human rights organizations don't stand with the Iranian people, why they are not present when these atrocities are happening on the ground.
و من میخوام این حرف درست نباشه، این حرف حقیقت نداشته باشه. من میخوام که ثابت کنیم به مردم ایران که حقوق بشر همراه با مردم ایرانه، نه همراه با جمهوری اسلامی. ممنونم.
I hope to show that this assumption is not true, that human rights organizations and institutions stand with Iranian people.
And not the regime.
I mean, I think that in terms of the UN itself, I mean, as I said, we're an independent body, so I'm not speaking for the UN. And we don't have, I think we're all here in that capacity. But but we do get information from different organizations and agencies. And I think as far as international human rights organizations go, we have actually relied on quite a number of both Iranian human rights organizations working abroad and Iranian activists inside, but also international human rights organizations that have helped to bring together a lot of the information and evidence themselves. So I think that they have actually been active. I think people can be more active even than they are, but they have been, and that's been a very important part of the information base that we've relied on. And I think even the fact-finding mission even exists is because of the work that many of them have done to advocate with the Human Rights Council member states, to have the resolution that brought it into being. So I think you're right, it's that there needs to be more, but there already is considerable engagement. And one thing I feel that we could maybe do more of is reach out to more of the world. Because I think that, we see, obviously we're sitting here in the US now, and I know there's a huge Iranian community here as well that is very deeply concerned with the situation inside Iran. But I think there are people around the globe as well who would be concerned if they were informed and if they were connected with. And I think the issues in terms of, not only in terms of women's rights within Iran, but the kind of extraordinary movement of young people, I think that's something people all around the globe will connect with. And Iran has a very special place in many people's hearts, not only because of your incredible culture, Hafiz. Those are things that other people all over the world also treasure and cherish, and they look to Iran as a very special place. But so I think that making those contacts with other places around the world, with the Global South in particular, where there are movements again for women's rights, for young people, protesting for freedom and liberty and so on, I think that will also help to strengthen the whole movement.
Thank you so much. I'll let you do the translating. Is it possible to extend the FFMI's mandate beyond the March deadline, do you think?
I'm not too sure. That's not really in our hands. That's something that the member states will vote on. It may be challenging, I think, because the focus was around the particular, the mandate was kind of focused around the protests that broke out after 16 September. And as I said, in this year also we've seen that we've gone beyond investigating particular incidents and situations to looking more into who's responsible. So I'm not sure that we'll be able to extend the mandate, but I think it's important to know there's a special rapporteur on Iran as well who documents and investigates reports of violations. It's now a Japanese law professor, Professor Mai Sato, who's based in Australia. So she's available, and we'll wait and see what happens next year. A lot of it depends also on developments and the work of other actors and organizations.
Of course. Somebody wants to know, does the UN have any better communication or response with the new appointed president, Pezeshkian?
I don't have the answer to that, but I don't think so, right? Yeah, no.
No, didn't think so. Why does having contact with the Islamic Republic matter so much? Historically, we know that they cheat and they hide the truth. So why does it make a difference to actually be in contact with them?
Well, I think when you're doing an investigation, you're not coming into it with a preconception, right? You need to hear all sides. And in a way, that matters for any investigation. You have to hear all sides, then you have to come to an analysis of where things stand. But I can see where that question is coming from, that you have a sense that, as we've also heard from many people, that where the state is not only denying what's happened, and not only denying violations, but trying to literally rewrite the reality, you may feel, well, why engage with that state? Why have any efforts to communicate with them? But I think the communication is important, and I should have said earlier also that even though we've not had direct engagement, except for that one exception, with the Islamic Republic, we have of course looked at what they say in public. So we've looked at huge amounts of official documentation from them, and we have analyzed that. And I think that needs to be done, because that helps to demonstrate actually that the kind of denial and the kind of refusal to acknowledge the reality. I think it strengthens the investigation rather than weakens it. So it's important to do it.
Yeah, and somebody's asking what what do you recommend that people in the audience do? Is there specific actions they should take? And it says here, after all the detailed forensics and violations, what actions can be taken against Iran or the Islamic Republic? And why haven't we heard much about this?
There are a number of things that I think people can do. But maybe just before coming to that, in terms of what we've documented, it's clear that, and we've also spoken about what we need is justice and accountability for these violations, reparations for the victims, and of course, most importantly, telling the truth about what's happened to so many people in terms of the violations and international crimes that have occurred. Now, the possibility of doing that within Iran is virtually non-existent. We found through our investigations, we found information about only 2 cases, I think, where people have been convicted for some of the violations that have occurred during this time. And I think we have concerns also even about the process through which that's been done. But this means that, and as we said, and we said this in our report as well, that really the only possibilities for justice for the violations that have occurred in Iran are really at an international level and in terms of third countries. Gisut spoke about it earlier today, that under the principles of universal jurisdiction, it is possible to try to hold people to account in third countries, and that may be one, that is an important process to follow. But in terms of what everyone here can do, one is, I think, obviously not to lose hope. We've heard through this entire session today about how, and the videos we've seen also have shown us, I think, first of all, like the extraordinary kind of, almost the effort to normalize the horrors that people have experienced. But I think seeing those images together with the courage that has been shown by those who stand up to that horror, right, who resist it, that kind of shows us, I think, what we all need to do, which is keep on bearing witness to what has happened. Don't be engulfed by the fact that many other things are happening all over the world too. We have to stand up wherever you see any kind of injustice, but this is an issue many of you care about and are invested in, and you have to carry on being the ones who push it forward and don't allow it to be covered up or forgotten. And I think it's really important that what we're finding also is that it's not that the protests happened in September 22 and then they stopped and now everything is different and we're just kind of tying up some loose ends. That's not the case, because we're still hearing, a few days ago, and it was just a few days ago that we were all commemorating the 2nd anniversary of Jina Mahsa's death in custody. And it's extraordinary, but people were not able to commemorate that massacre. I mean, even her family and others who wanted to do that inside Iran were stopped from doing that, and they were intimidated and threatened again. So the fact that that kind of extreme repression is still going on, and that people inside Iran, and of course you're all familiar and you know very well about the issues in terms of, embedded, structural, deep-rooted discrimination against women and girls. And that is something that I think, concerns the whole of the world, and something, again, you have to keep speaking out on. But perhaps even beyond that is the fact that, so many remarkable people, Elahi, Khusru, so many others around here, who all say we want to be inside our own country, living our lives the way we were doing, and we want to continue to do that. We've only left our country because we had no other choice. But I think the point is, to keep fighting so people can go back home, and the people who are there can get back the country that they want. So I think you have to be part of that, and we can't give in to. I think that's the purpose, right, of the horror and all the rest of it, is to get people to say this is impossible. Nothing's ever going to happen. Nothing's ever going to change. Let's just move on and lead our lives and get on with what we can do. I think you have to resist that to the maximum, and you have to resist it because people like Elahi have resisted it. We've seen so many people just standing up and refusing to accept that they should bow down and they should turn around and they should go away. So I think that's what we all have to do in this room as well, is just keep on at it and speaking about it and speaking to each other and to others about what's happening.
Absolutely. And my final question, somebody wants to know, of the 29 letters that you wrote and you only got one response, which letter was it that elicited a response, and what was the response?
That's a rare one. It was a letter about, there was one case that we were informed where one person had been convicted and unfortunately sentenced to death. And we had sent a letter about that, and we got a response on that from the permanent mission.
Aha. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Sara Hossain. It was an honor. Thank you,
Thank you, Nazanin.
Gisu. Thank you so much to the Strategic Litigation Center at the Atlantic Council, and thank you all for coming.